Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased you could join us today for Supporting Parents, Adverse Childhood Experience, and Responding to the Caregiver. My name is Angelina Hart, and I'm the coordinator for the New York State Parenting Education Partnership. Heather Larkin is on the line to present today's 90-minute professional development webinar, and I'll introduce Heather in just a few moments. But first of all, Heather, I just wanted to quickly check in with you and ask if you can see the NICEPEP website on your screen.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So for those of you who are joining us, I wanted to let you know today's webinar is sponsored by the New York State Parenting Education Partnership, or NICEPEP for short. And we have support from the New York State Office of Mental Health and New York's Greater Capital Region Healthy Environments and Relationships That Support, which is also known as the Hearts Initiative out of the University at Albany, and also Prevent Child Abuse New York is sponsoring today's webinar. So we've really combined forces today to bring you this information. And before we start, I just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping. If you need technical support, please visit http://help.citrix, that's citrix.com/webinar. That's all lowercase and there's no www. I am going to send that link to everybody right now in the chat box. So if you do have any technical support issues, please contact our webinar service provider. Right now, everyone is in listen-only mode. So we can't hear anything that you say or what's going on in the background. We will have some time towards the end of this webinar for questions from the audience. So what we'll ask is that you type in your questions into the question box at that time, and then we'll read those aloud, and Heather can respond to those questions. So you might want to, if you have an opportunity to grab like a pen and a sheet of paper, you might want to take some notes so that if you have questions along the way, you can be sure to remember and when we open up for questions. I also want to let you all know that everyone attending today is going to receive an automated thank you for attending email tomorrow afternoon. And that email is going to contain a link to today's webinar recording. So we are recording now. And it's also going to contain some additional resources and access to the post-test. All of you should have taken the pre-test when you registered for the webinar. I'm going to send everybody the link to the pre-test right now in the chat box. However, I just want to mention something about the post-test. This is a reminder. If you are applying for CEUs, please do not take the post-test until after the final webinar in this series concludes in August. We do provide that post-test link in each of the thank you for attending emails that go out after the conclusion of each webinar, because some people attending today may only choose to attend this one webinar and not the rest in the series. And we want everyone to have an opportunity to participate in the post-test. So if you're not seeking CEUs, and this is the only or else the final webinar in the ACE series that you're planning to attend live, then you can go ahead and complete the post-test tomorrow when you get that link in your email. But if you're going for CEUs, please wait. You may need to check your spam folder if you don't receive the automated thank you email by 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. So complete information about the ACE webinar series, including details about the CEUs, can be accessed on our website, and you can see that on your screen right now. And there's a link to click here for more information and registration links, and if you click on that, it'll give you all the details about the series, about Heather, the registration registration links there's 2 more webinars in the series, as well as specific instructions for CEUs. So with that, I just wanted to mention a little bit about the New York State Parenting Education Partnership, or NICEPEP, for those of you who may not be familiar. This is a professional organization for individuals who are engaged in or interested in parenting education. And it includes parenting educators, related professionals, students, and lay leaders who provide services to parents and families with children, as well as those who fund, support, and advocate for parenting education at local and state levels in New York. Our goal is to enhance parenting skills, knowledge, and behavior that ensures children grow up in nurturing environments. So NICEPEP serves as a source of information, resources, and support programs for parenting education in New York State. We establish professional standards for the field through the Parenting Educator Credential Core Competencies, and those define knowledge and skills specifically needed to provide high-quality programs. We also provide in-service education at locations across the state through our Strong Roots full-day training on topics associated with effectiveness in parenting education. And there will be more information coming in August about Strong Roots for this fall. So keep an eye out later in August for that. Also, NICEPEP awards mini grants each year to providers of evidence-based parenting education services. And we expect that an application for the 2016 mini grants will post to our website sometime in August. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Heather Larkin. I'm going to actually switch the screen over to Heather. Heather Larkin is an associate professor at the University of Albany's School of Social Welfare. She's the director of the National Center for Excellence in Homeless Services and project director of the Healthy Environments and Relationships That Supports Initiative for Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE Response. She also volunteers as a consultant for the Center for Post-Trauma Wellness. And with that, I would like to give this over to Heather.
Great, thanks so much, Angelina. I'm happy and honored to have this chance to talk with all of you today. The title of the presentation is Supporting Parents, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and Responding to the Caregiver. Couple things I want to let you know is that I will be overviewing a bit of some of the information on the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, but not quite as in-depth as the first webinar. You might want to go back to the recording of that one if you want a little bit more in-depth information. And if you were on that webinar, I'll be presenting it a little bit differently, more of a quicker overview, and really emphasizing working with parents and caregivers and those implications as we talk about the ACE study a little bit. And my hope, too, in reviewing that information is that it makes it easier for all of you who might then want to take this information and share it as well. I always thank Vincent Politi, one of the original ACE study authors, for sharing some of his slides with me, the ones specific to the ACE study, and I'm always happy to share slides with people who are participating in a presentation as well, because it then gives you the opportunity to share what is really simple and compelling and important information for all of us in human services, social services, just anybody involved in building community protective factors and resilience. I also want to let you know that there are resources on www.aceresponse.org, and as we receive the recordings from these webinars in the series as well, we will be posting those also on that website too. And there is a links and resource page that we're updating, and also there are some new sections being built into the website over time. So that can be a resource for you as well. Our goals for today's presentation is one, understanding ACEs and trauma, specifically as we think about what does this mean for supporting parents and caregivers, really focusing on prevention and thinking about families and working with parents. So thinking about how do we break intergenerational cycles and consider ACE response across the lifespan. A lot of times when people hear about adverse childhood experiences, their consequences, preventing adverse childhood experiences, they think about focusing on the children, which is important. We want to prevent ACEs wherever possible, but there are also opportunities to prevent some of the later life consequences of adverse childhood experiences, and also to break some of those intergenerational cycles of transmission of ACEs. And in doing so, I'll present the RIS model, specifically again for thinking through how does this apply to supporting parents and caregivers. So this is a conceptual framework for a comprehensive whole person kind of a response that really looks at and emphasizes mobilizing, supporting, fostering people's resilience, recovery, the ability to move forward in their life and not necessarily have to experience some of the negative consequences of accumulated adversity and trauma that we're going to learn about. As if any of you have been in my presentations or webinars before, I always start out reminding people about self-care. I think that's one of the most important implications of all of this developing research on accumulated adversity and trauma is how pervasive it is, how much it affects all of us, and particularly those of us who are involved with supporting people who have had significant adversities and traumas in their life. How do we promote our own resilience and role model that for others? Those of you who are supporting parents and caregivers, taking care of yourself is also role modeling for the parents and caregivers that need to take care of themselves really well so that they're able to continue to do better with the children in their care. So I recognize that we all have different ways of taking care of ourselves, and we have to evaluate what's working for us at different times. So I'm not telling you to do any specific thing to take care of yourself, but to really reflect on, what is it that helps you to take care of yourself, particularly when you're learning about some activating material and being presented with information about trauma in particular. So just to review from previous presentations, there are different causes of trauma. Sometimes when people talk about trauma, they mean physical injury, like when somebody shows up in the hospital with a physical injury. And what we're focusing on here as well, in addition to that, is also emotional injury. And again, that can include vicarious trauma. So again, important to think about, how do we promote our own resilience, and how do we help parents and caregivers promote their resilience to prevent that kind of vicarious trauma or getting triggered for whatever our own past adversities or traumas have been when trying to help somebody to move forward dealing with something traumatic that they're talking about in their life currently. In particular, we're talking about the adverse childhood experiences research, because these are adversities that happen earlier in life, prior to the age of 18, when people are still developing across many different lines of development. And so there's the potential for development to be derailed in a different way than when adverse experiences occur later in life for people, and especially when people have had accumulated adversity. We know so much more now about how the accumulations of adversity, toxic stress, trauma can impact the body and play out across the lifespan in terms of different kinds of, not just mental health and substance abuse and other health risk consequences, but actual serious health problems down the road. But certainly adverse adult experiences could be traumatic too. And I want to point out that what's traumatic for one person may not necessarily be traumatic for another person. So there is a distinction between adversity and trauma. When we talk about adverse events, adverse childhood experiences, or other adverse events that could take place at different points in life, these are typically observable events that we can see happened. Now, how they affect a person, we would need to ask questions to better understand that. Again, two people could have the same experience, and for one person, it could be traumatic, and for another person, not. And that has a lot to do with our capacities and supports. Capacities can include people's developmental capacity, your inner ability to handle the events that you're confronted with, including your inner resilience, but also the supports, services, access to services, all of that that we might have available or not available in our environment playing a role too. So it's actually kind of complex. What is adversity versus what is trauma? And that's important to keep in mind. As always, it's also important to keep in mind that, at the same time that people can experience adversity and be traumatized, people also can be incredibly resilient and can recover from traumatic experiences and at times even experience post-traumatic growth, not just post-traumatic stress disorder. And so, what we're talking about here is looking at how can you support parents who may have had their own adversities while they're helping to prevent further adversity in the children that they're raising, or caregivers. When we think about trauma too, there's also collective trauma. So examples of this would be neighborhood violence, other kinds of social violence, living in a war zone, experiencing a natural disaster. So there's, again, all different kinds of events that could be traumatic to people, and sometimes people will, experience an event in a more isolated way, and sometimes events will happen to whole communities or groups. And again, people can experience these kinds of things differently, and it has so much to do with both our inner and outer capacities to handle the events that we're confronted with. So again, when we talk about adversity and trauma and adverse childhood experiences in particular, I emphasize the adverse childhood experiences research, one, because it has the potential to, particularly when there's accumulated adversities in people's life, and people are younger and still developing across numerous lines of development, there's the potential for more problems, and more likely that it could be that a young person's not able to handle some of these experiences. Not necessarily the case, again, depending on supports that people have. But certainly, we know from research that these are experiences growing up that can deeply impact a young person and then can profoundly affect emotional and physical health later in life. And this adverse childhood experiences research is pretty simple and compelling and easy to understand and convey to others. And I think it's important for us all to be able to talk about this research because it can be helpful in sharing information in the larger community about why do we need certain supports, reaching policymakers, funders about investing in programs and support services that respond to adversity and trauma in helpful ways, because many of us are in this field because we know that there are things that we can do that are of great assistance to people. Now, as I said before too, often when we think about adverse childhood experiences, we're thinking about how do we prevent these in the young person, but part of that is also helping parents and caregivers with their own adverse childhood experiences and helping them to promote the resilience and prevent further adverse consequences for the children in their care. The ACE study was originally was put together in '94. The first publication was in '98. It was begun by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. Two medical doctors, Vincent Felitti at Kaiser Permanente, Rob Anda at the Centers for Disease Control. And what they wanted to better understand was how are people engaging in health risk behavior were ways to cope with accumulated adversities, trauma in their life that had happened earlier on, and then these personal solutions were causing other emotional and physical health challenges in their lives. So what these doctors started to realize is that there's a lot going on beyond physical behaviors and physical symptoms that are important to pay attention to, and really calls us to a more holistic approach and recognizing that there's roles that we can all play in the community to create supports and protective factors for people, both in preventing ACEs and preventing some of the consequences that can play out in people's lives. So in terms of the ACE score, again, this is a really quick overview. These medical doctors, in their study, they had 17,000 participants, which in itself was unique to have such a large sample participating in the study, but also they looked at a number of categories of adverse childhood experiences. They asked adults to report retrospectively, yes or no, did you experience this particular category of adversity prior to the age of 18? So they weren't looking at number of incidents, they were looking at categories based on their review of the literature and their thinking about what might be based on that background literature playing a role in health risk behaviors. The categories from the ACE study, and actually they grew from 7 to 10 categories over time. The 10 categories are physical abuse by a parent, physical neglect by a parent, emotional abuse by a parent, emotional neglect by a parent, sexual abuse by anyone, experiencing the loss of a parent in some way, witnessing domestic violence in the home, growing up in a household where a parent was experiencing a substance abuse problem, growing up in a household where a parent was experiencing mental illness, or growing up in a household where somebody was incarcerated. So those were the 10 categories. Based on the number of yes responses, they created an ACE score. With the ACE score, another unique thing about this study was that then they were able to look at the associations between the ACE score and later in life, not only mental health, substance abuse problems, but other health risk behaviors and serious health problems. They also were able to look at the interrelationship of categories of adversity, and they found that when there's one category, there's more likely to be other categories. So they found, for one thing, that adverse childhood experiences were more prevalent than they had anticipated. About 2/3 of this predominantly population in their sample had at least one category of adverse childhood experience. More than 1/3 had experienced 2 to 4 ACEs. They found women were more likely to have ACE scores of 5 or more, and it's important to note that ACE scores of 4 or more were associated with more multiple co-occurring kinds of problems. So when we think about working with supporting parents and caregivers in particular, well, one is, we recognize how pervasive this is, with 2/3 of a predominantly middle-class population having at least one category of adverse childhood experience. That also includes those of us who are providers, who are impacted by ACEs in some way, and really speaks to the importance of including in our ideas of what do we do to support others, including what do we do to promote our own resilience as part of the intervention, because then that's going to have an impact on our relationship building, our role modeling, and our ability to continue to advocate for and support others. So there's an important implication. The other is that working with parents and caregivers of children who may have high ACE scores, it's quite likely that they have some adversity as well, just like many people in society, that, again, it's important to promote their resilience so that they can help the child that's in their care and be role modeling resilience, and that impacting their relationship building as well. So really a parallel process with those of you who are providing supports to parents and caregivers. But also, sometimes we'll hear providers say, how could this parent have let this happen? How could they, let their child have an ACE score of 4 or something like that? And, then often we'll find out that the parent themselves might have an ACE score of 6 or something, and that they're actually doing better than was done by them. And so then it helps you to start thinking about, well, how do I support this parent to continue to do better and prevent more ACEs in their child, prevent also the consequences of those ACEs down the road, and look at how do we help the parent to get the support they need to prevent the consequences of their own ACE backgrounds, including that intergenerational transmission. So hopefully, my hope is that learning about this ACE research really helps to increase awareness and compassion. And again, that we all have a role in can have a role in providing support and creating protective factors, contributing to a resilient community and really a culture of health. So I'm just going to show you some quick slides because sometimes it's helpful to have a visual. This is by no means exhaustive. By this point, there's more than 70 articles published from the original ACE study showing that the ACEs are correlated with a whole host of mental health, substance abuse, health risk behaviors, and many serious health problems. But sometimes it's helpful to have a few visual graphs. So here you can see, as ACE score increases, the likelihood of current smoking increases. It doesn't mean that you're going to be a smoker if you have a high ACE score. It just means that it's associated with it, that there's a higher likelihood. Here we can see as ACE score increases, the likelihood of acknowledged adult alcoholism increases. Again, there's articles on all of these and many other issues. If anybody's interested, I have most of the ACE articles, and you can email me at hlarkin@albany.edu if you have an interest in a particular area and are looking for an article. You'll also see my email again on the last slide of this presentation. Here we have ACEs and chronic depression. An adult with an ACE score of 4 is something like 260% more likely to experience a major depressive episode later in life. Here we have ACEs and intravenous drug use. A male child with an ACE score of 6 is 46 times more likely to become an IV drug user than a male with an ACE score of 0. Again, these are not cause and effect. It does not mean that if you have a high ACE score, you're going to become an IV drug user. These are associations. And again, these are just a few illustrative graphs that I've shown you. In fact, the medical doctors, Vincent Felitti and Rob Anda, who conducted this original very large ACE study at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego with 17,000 participants, now say that ACEs are implicated in the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. There are many, many articles now looking at ACE score and its association, correlation with many later in life health problems, in addition to health risk behaviors, mental health and substance abuse concerns. Just some of these include liver disease, multiple types of cancer, chronic lung disease, skeletal fractures. There's also an article showing the correlation between ACE score and impaired job functioning, which starts to get us thinking about some of the other implications. ACEs as well. There's even an article on ACEs and early death. When I had first learned about the ACE research and the connection with ACE score and impaired job functioning and this whole host of challenges that increase with higher ACE scores later in life, I realized that many of us who are working in social services are working with high ACE score groups, and we don't necessarily talk about it that way. We're often helping people who are experiencing multiple co-occurring problems. And the ACEs research really speaks to the value of investing in supports and services that respond effectively to some of these later life consequences of ACEs. And if we can intervene and effectively help people who have had accumulated adversity and trauma, perhaps we are playing a role in preventing some really serious high-cost health problems later in life as well. And this is important for policymakers and agency and community leaders to think about, and to think about then the value of creating supportive programs, creating healthier communities, more coordinated services, finding ways to work together in a more holistic way, so that we are hopefully saving money as we help people effectively to address adversity and trauma before it leads to all of these later in life consequences. When I had first learned about the ACE study, as I mentioned, I was struck by the fact that often in social services we're helping people who are experiencing multiple problems, and that there's the opportunity for us to work more comprehensively across systems. And I thought, well, let me start by looking at people who are experiencing homelessness. And we know from other research that people who are experiencing homelessness experience more multiple co-occurring issues. And frontline workers will say that people have had a lot of adversity prior to the adversity of becoming homeless. So I had a sample in New York and California of about 220 participants, found that 87% reported at least one category of adverse childhood experience, and more than half reported 4 or more. And again, when we saw those scores of 4 or more in the ACE study, that's when you saw more multiple co-occurring problems. Also, ACE categories were predicting prior services used, and there may be some implications about creating ACE-informed care that could help to reduce some of the individual vulnerability to homelessness. And if you remember from the original ACE study, there was that finding of ACE score being correlated with the impaired job functioning as well. So it may be that people with higher ACE scores have more individual vulnerability to some of the societal conditions that are contributing to homelessness. And again, this speaks to looking at this issue in a holistic way and considering how we can work together across professions and look at policies and their impacts on our communities to help people who have had accumulated adversities and trauma in their lives. So when we think about this, this was a quick overview of the ACEs research and some of the findings. Again, you may want to go back to the first webinar that gave a more in-depth overview on the ACE study, and I'm happy to share resources, and there are also resources posted on the ACE Response website. Background articles you can email me for. But let's think about this now in terms of parent-caregiver implications, even just from that very quick overview. So we have some real prevention opportunities here, that we have the opportunity to prevent the ACE consequences in parents and caregivers who may have their own ACE backgrounds. So that means that by providing them adequate supports and services to help address and resolve some of these traumas in their life and hopefully prevent further consequences for them that could be high-cost consequences. Also, it could be preventing intergenerational transmissions. So again, we're thinking about how do we support parents and caregivers so that, one, they're promoting their own resilience as they help children who have experienced ACEs and prevent further ACEs in the children, regardless of whether they have had their own ACEs or not, promoting their resilience so that they can do that work and prevent vicarious trauma, but also recognizing that the ACE research found how pervasive ACEs are. It could be that a parent or caregiver has their own ACE background, so all the more important to promote their resilience. And if they're a high ACE score parent or caregiver, how do we help them to get the additional services they need beyond the support that you're providing them, so that they can prevent some of those consequences in their own lives and again continue to be able to do better for the children that are in their care. So a really strong emphasis here on promoting resilience. There's a connection to self-care, that when we're thinking then about, okay, well, I've learned about all of this ACE research and I want to apply it to supporting parents and caregivers. Well, if somebody asked me what would I say is the first thing to do, I would say, well, the first thing to do is to think about, as a provider who's offering support to parents and caregivers, what can you do to strengthen your own self-care, to promote your own resilience, because that has everything to do with your relationship building and role modeling for the parent, and also helping them in supporting their self-care, because that has everything to do with their ability to promote their resilience, prevent vicarious trauma, and to continue to help doing better with the children that are in their care. Secondarily, I would also say, let's share this information with the larger community, policymakers, funders, to raise awareness about the importance of providing adequate support to parents and caregivers, because it could have high payoffs down the road if we're preventing some of the high costs associated with ACEs and ACE consequences. Also, implications are moving away from some of the fragmented service silos and just looking at how can we work together more? How can we create a more coordinated system of care in our communities? And how do we engage the larger community, recognizing that we can all play a role in creating a culture of health, creating more resilient communities, thinking about the power of peer supports, relationship building, role model, the potential for people to be leaders in all kinds of ways in creating protective factors in communities. So basically, moving beyond fragmented services, thinking more holistically, and seeing the role of anybody in ACE response in the community. In terms of ACE-informed care and supports, I work with a number of agencies that have been translating this ACE research into their programs over the past several years, and they all look different because they might provide different kinds of supports to people at different points in the lifespan. But there's some key elements. These are, one, identifying adverse childhood experiences, not necessarily asking everybody you serve what are their exact categories of adverse childhood experience, but recognizing that these might be characteristics of the people that we serve. And then thinking about, okay, if we're integrating resilience and recovery knowledge, how do we very intentionally create a culture that promotes resilience and recovery as we're thinking about supporting the people that we serve? It also involves transforming systems, helping agencies starting to look at how does each service and support that they provide address ACEs or ACE consequences in one way or another so that they're more integrated, and also considering how does that program fit within the larger system of care in the community. So again, moving towards more service coordination opportunities to work together. And different professionals might be highly trained in dealing with a particular consequence of ACEs at a different point in the lifespan with a different age group. But often what we're starting to see now is agencies that serve seemingly different population groups with different focus areas, actually all talking about ACEs being common characteristics of the people that they serve, and then that provides a shared language across systems and helps to see how these services and supports may fit together for families. Empowering people, recognizing, as I said before, that we can all play a role in creating healthier communities, healthier social networks, peer supports, leadership, and building protective factors. And thinking more holistically, a whole person approach. People are not the sum of their problems. People can do incredible things, and the people that you're working with may have survived a great deal. And so how do we support the whole person and work together in doing that and take a whole community kind of a perspective as we consider that. So these are some of the implications. So the original ACE study authors had created this conceptual framework to explain how do adverse childhood experiences lead to these later in life serious high-cost health problems and even early death. Well, they suggest that adverse childhood experiences may contribute to disrupted neurodevelopment, which then leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. That people may actually be adopting health risk behaviors, such as smoking or substance abuse or sexual acting out, as a way to try to feel better. That these actually may be personal solutions that then lead to later in life disease, disability, social problems, and even early death. What's important to notice is that the pyramid gets smaller as you go towards the top, and it does not necessarily mean that adverse childhood experiences are going to lead to early death. So in fact, there's an to intervene at any point along the lifespan to support people in turning things around and building on their strengths and capacities and resilience that have helped them to survive so far. And when we're thinking about supporting parents and caregivers, we're recognizing that no matter what somebody has been through before and what they're helping their children to go through, that they have unique strengths, capacities, areas of resilience that we can help to support as our response to adverse childhood experiences, backgrounds for caregivers and parents. So this is just thinking about a human being more holistically. As I said, people are not just the sum of their problems, and there's always an opportunity to break the trajectory from ACEs to negative later life health consequences and other problems. So one way of thinking about a person holistically is to recognize people are body, mind, and spirit expressing in self, community, and nature. This is not spirit in any particular religious way, but just recognizing there's something more to a person, some ineffable aspect of them or consciousness, a sense of spirituality that is a part of what a person can draw on. One way that I have found to be really helpful in thinking about this whole holistic kind of perspective and what it means for support is the integral quadrants. So here we have quadrants. This is one concept from integral theory by Ken Wilber. The top two quadrants represent the individual. The bottom two quadrants represent the collective or community. The idea of quadrants, I think, is helpful because you can see that these are all interacting. They're really not separate. The right-hand side are things we can easily observe about individuals and communities. The left-hand side are things that we would need to ask questions to find out about. So when we're thinking about supporting a parent or caregiver, we want to do more than just pay attention to things that are observable in the individual. There might be behaviors that are healthy and helpful and good parenting behaviors. There might be behaviors that could be improved. We also can observe physical health, physical characteristics, but if we really want to support somebody effectively, we need to understand more about what's behind that. So we wouldn't want to limit ourselves to only what can we observe about the individual. So then on the upper left side, there's the interior of the individual. What is this person's unique thoughts and meaning that they're making about things? How are they feeling? What are their strengths and capacities? How have they been resilient and survived things in the past? But also people are developing and living and behaving in the context of community relationships. So then we move to the lower quadrants. There's things we can observe about systemic interactions. The lower right quadrant, or we can observe family and other relational systems, how people interact. We can observe the way our educational, social service, and other systems work, economic system policies, etc., are set up. But if we want to understand more about why those systemic interactions are taking place the way that they are, we would need to ask questions. And that's the lower left quadrant, really understanding shared meanings and values, the culture. And it's actually the culture is reflected in the way that we meet people, observable interactions between people, and the way that we set up our systems. So, this is a helpful way, I think, of seeing, okay, there's certain things we can observe on the right side about individuals and communities, and individuals are part of communities, and communities are impacting on individuals. They're not separate in that way. But then we wouldn't want to only focus on things that we can observe. We want to understand them better. And so the left side is the subjective of the individual, the interior of the individual, and an understanding of the shared meanings and values of the culture. So shorthand for these quadrants would be self, culture, and nature. So the upper left quadrant is self, the interior of the self. The lower left quadrant is culture, the shared meanings within the culture. And then the right quadrants together would be just observable things about the world. So you could call those nature for shorthand. Other shorthand is the I, we, it, and its quadrants. So the interior of the individual, the upper left quadrant is the I quadrant. The lower left quadrant is the we quadrant. So how do you and I understand one another? How do we become a we? And then the right side quadrants would be it and its quadrants. So when you're just looking at something, observing something, the grammar for that would be it and its. So another way is first person, second person, and third person perspectives. The upper left quadrant is a first person perspective, the interior of the individual. The lower left quadrant is a second person perspective, the shared subjective meaning making of a culture. And then the right quadrants would be third person singular and third person plural. So again, I, we, it, and its. Again, there was a previous webinar where we went through the Restorative Integral Support model in a little bit more depth, so you could always go back and review that recording as well. So when we think then about helping parents, we apply the quadrants. This also helps us to understand both, the difference between adversity and trauma, and also how can this become intergenerational. So adverse interactions or events would be observable interactions typically within relational systems. So we would map that to the lower right quadrant. Even in just focusing on systemic interactions, there's other things we would want to pay attention to and understand in terms of how they are impacting on people who are interacting within systems. So also looking at other issues of social violence, including poverty, natural disasters, the extent to which people have access to services and supports in their community, and also policies. And then moving over to the lower left quadrant, in terms of thinking about, well, okay, how do things and events that we can observe, adverse events, how do they potentially become traumatic or not traumatic? Well, a lot of it has to do with, as we talked about before, people's inner and outer resources and capacities. So lower left quadrant, what kinds of shared meanings are made about the events in people's lives, what kinds of social networks do people have available to them, including peer supports? Are they able to talk about what they're going through, get help and support to change or deal with what they're experiencing? Also, cultural values are important here. Certainly our larger culture seems to value rugged individualism, and that can work against people accessing supports and talking about their experiences, but that's not the case for everybody's culture. Some people might be in a better position to be able to access social networks for help in all kinds of different ways. Some people might be more able to access supports for a whole variety of reasons, or less able to access supports. One of the things the original ACE study authors talked about was that there's social taboos against talking about adversity and trauma. It's not socially acceptable to bring these things up, and that can work against us asking about it, people talking about it, or us asking about it in systems. So remember that lower right systems are a reflection of our lower left culture. And together, rugged individualism, that value that people should somehow pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and it not being okay to talk about these things can contribute to victim blaming in the larger culture. So those seem to be some things in the larger culture that can work against getting help and support for dealing with adverse experiences. But again, it's not the case for everybody's culture, and so this is why I think it's helpful to have this full quadrant perspective to make sure that we're touching base with each of the quadrant perspectives and asking questions and figuring out where people's resources and supports are, and what kind of meanings that they're making from their experience. And people's individual perception of what's going on has so much to do with the culture and community that they're a part of. So moving then to the upper left quadrant, that's where you have the perception of something being traumatic, which is really a person's assessment of whether they're able to handle an event or not. And again, that has to do with your own inner developmental capacity and inner strengths and resources, resilience, but also your supports in the community, the lower quadrants. What kind of supports and services do you have available to you? So one of the things that the original ACE study authors suggest, without necessarily using this framework, is that When people don't have adequate supports and have experienced accumulated adversity in particular, they're more likely to feel overwhelmed, feel traumatized, maybe activate defense mechanisms, and look for ways to try to make themselves feel better when they're not having adequate support for dealing with their feelings. And then those looking for ways to make themselves feel better would be reflected in upper right quadrant observable behaviors, which might be health risk behaviors, smoking, substance abuse, other kinds of substance abuse, etc. Things to make yourself feel better that could then lead to short and long-term medical problems. There's also a recognition now from brain science research that's been carried out over the past 10 to 15 years that accumulated adversity, toxic stress, etc., can lead to changes in the developing brain. So that's a whole other area of study that people can get into as well. So that's another way in which you can see that this would be reflected in observable aspects of the individual. With these quadrant perspective, you can also start to see how this could become intergenerational. So say somebody has high ACE score, so mapped to the lower right quadrant, adversity is taking place particularly within family relationships, then lower left quadrant, lack of supports, inability to talk about it, upper left quadrant, feeling overwhelmed, not having a place to learn to manage feelings or talk through feelings, and then upper right quadrant, looking for ways to feel better, maybe engaging in substance abuse. Then you become a parent. Substance abuse is then an ACE for the child. So you can kind of see how that could play out. At the same time, this quadrant perspective really expands our opportunities for thinking about where we could provide supports and interventions to help prevent this kind of intergenerational transmission or these intergenerational cycles, as well as later life consequences. So there's many opportunities and angles to intervene, especially remembering that the quadrants are not separate. So something that they're really just different perspectives on the same event. And so something that we do that might be mapped to one of the quadrants is going to have an impact on all of the quadrants. So let's move along then to thinking about what does this mean for supporting parents and caregivers. So here we have Restorative Integral Support model is an application of this framework from integral theory specifically to adverse childhood experiences and trauma. So here you can look at all of the many opportunities for intervention mapped to the different quadrants. So we can look at lower right quadrant, what kind of policies and procedures we want to set up to create our systems of support in communities in certain ways so that they're addressing ACEs, acknowledging them, aware of them, helping people to get the support that they need, increasingly coordinated and recovery-oriented. We can look at lower left quadrant, how do we intentionally develop social networks, look at how do we work together to create a culture of health, mobilize resilience in communities, build protective factors, strengthen peer support opportunities, look at the culture within the programs within which we're working. As somebody who's providing support to parents and caregivers, what is the context within which we're providing that support, and how do we contribute to creating a culture of recovery and transformation? And again, key to that is looking at our own self-care, how we promote our own resilience so that we're doing relationship building and role modeling. We're contributing to a culture of recovery and transformation within which we're providing the support that we are. On the individual, upper quadrants, the interior of the individual, certainly we're looking at how do we support this unique individual strengths, finding out what those strengths are. Like I said, how have people survived in the past? What are they good at? What works for this unique person to mobilize their resilience and recovery? Enhancing people's coping skills, also helping to build other life skills. In this case, really, supporting people's parenting and caregiving skills. And important in doing that, maybe helping people to get connected with other services. Again, the need for increasingly coordinated services that are might help them to resolve their own trauma if they have their own high ACE score background or other trauma, and restore development so that they're building their capacity to carry out new parenting skills and build on the parenting skills that they have to be able to support their children, prevent ACEs and ACE consequences for the children in their care. Upper right quadrant, there's certainly evidence-supported interventions that we can look at what's available in the community beyond the support that you're providing to parents and caregivers. How do you help people get some of these professional services that may be helpful to them? There's a whole range of trauma-specific interventions that different professionals might have skill in that could be helpful to somebody. Certainly medical services also. Also, when you're thinking about the physical aspects of the individual, observable aspects, body-oriented interventions like physical exercise, things like that can be helpful for people too and build their capacity for resilience. So here you can just quickly see, some of the opportunities for putting together supports for parents and caregivers. Then moving along, I've mapped some examples to each of the quadrants to think about specifically working with parents and caregivers. What are some things that we might do in each quadrant? So here we have the upper left quadrant, the I quadrant, the interior of the individuals. So people who have had, maybe feel they've had failures in their parenting or concerns about their parenting, how do we help them to develop a more positive story of their life, not as somebody who has failed, but as somebody who has survived, figured out how to survive a great deal in many cases, somebody who's been incredibly resilient, and helping to build on strengths and capacities to move forward from there. Helping people to identify what are their intentions and plans for parenting and caregiving. And sometimes as people gain new information too, that helps them to develop new intention and plans. I've worked with the director of a Kids First program at a homeless service agency who said one of the things that in their parenting skills class they taught was about, they showed pictures of the brain and how, from the CDC website I think it was, and how the accumulated adversity and stress and trauma could impact people's brains. And she said this was very powerful for the parents to realize that how important their parenting was, that it actually was going to have an impact on the child's brain development in some way, and really made them think about the importance of preventing adverse childhood experiences and their consequences for their own children and what that meant for them. So having new information can help people to set their intentions and plans, and then supporting people and taking the steps to move forward with their intentions and plans. Connecting people with professional services to help resolve trauma, other ACE consequences. Supporting people and building coping skills for dealing with anger, stress, and grief. Again, really looking at, how do we promote this person's or foster this person's resilience and recovery? What is their self-care plan? And again, that really speaks to the importance of the self-care for all of you who are supporting parents and caregivers, so that you're promoting your own resilience and contributing to a culture of recovery, and that has so much to do with your relationship building and role modeling for the parents and caregivers. So again, building life skills and parenting in particular might be an important upper left quadrant oriented support activity for helping parents and caregivers. Then moving over to the upper right quadrant, or the IT quadrant for short, making sure people's basic needs are met. And again, that might mean helping them connect with other services in the community. So Maslow's hierarchy, for example, shows that people's basic needs for food and shelter, et cetera, need to be met before they can move on to building their capacities in other areas. Certainly making sure people have adequate supports in taking care of their physical health, medical, dental supports. Also helping to support new parenting and caregiving behaviors. So, helping people to recognize what they're doing that's working and build in new skills and build on what's working. And physical exercise can be an important self-care activity that strengthens people's resilience and builds their capacity. the we quadrant. So how do we treat one another, our culture, our networks within our community? So important ways of supporting parents and caregivers could be looking for ways to develop more peer supports. Maybe this parent and caregiver that you're supporting can actually be in a position to lead a peer support. You know, they're learning and developing and can share with others as well. And all of that is contributing to hopefully healthy social networks. We know from research now how powerful social networks are. There's research by Christakis and Fowler from Framingham, Massachusetts, that shows that health behaviors are contagious in the context of social networks. They were looking at risky health behaviors like smoking, overeating that were contagious, but it also occurs to me that healthy behaviors, that resilience and recovery could be contagious within social networks too. So how do we strengthen our social networks and communities? How do we empower the people that we're supporting as parents and caregivers to create some of these support networks and to lead some of these support networks? All of this is in the service of building protective factors and culture of health. Spiritual and faith communities can be very helpful too to people within the community, not necessarily advocating any certain religion, but what works for people, and a resource and an access for support. Also other kinds of social groups that people can join. It can be helpful working in groups and classes and workshops on common goals. So, you know, if there's parenting skills classes, can be helpful in conjunction with working with people individually and supporting them individually. Again, the opportunity for parents to help other parents as well, and recognizing that we all can play a role in creating a context of resilience, recovery, and transformation. Moving over to the ITS quadrant, really looking at the policies and procedures within our programs that through which we provide support to parents and caregivers, and to what extent are those policies and procedures helping to create that lower left we quadrant culture that we just described. So is this a recovery-oriented system of care? Are the policies and procedures set up in such a way that it facilitates the development of social networks? Maybe people who are a little further along in programming could be in a position to help people who are newer in a program or some things. So in terms of developing peer supports, even what is our infrastructure, what is the way in which we operate at work, what is our process for reaching out and providing supports in the community for parents and caregivers? What does that look like? Like just really reflecting on how we have things set up, and is it the most conducive way to create the culture, the restorative context that we're looking for to facilitate our support for caregivers and providers. So program design is actually an important aspect of intervention. And I also want to point out we can create systems through which we share resources for support, and aceresponse.org is an example of that. So we try to put different resources up there and tools on the website so that we can all access them and share them easily, and have an opportunity for you to download PowerPoints and be able to give presentations like this yourself in your own community. So for thinking about families, thinking about ACE response for families, we're really thinking about a whole family approach. So again, you know, sometimes providers will have a tendency to say, oh my goodness, this child has an ACE score of 4, how could the parent let that happen? Well, we're also recognizing now that it may be the parent's actually doing much better. It could be a parent with an ACE score of 6 or more who has a child with an ACE score of 4. So thinking comprehensively, holistically, how do we address ACEs in parents while preventing ACEs and ACE consequences in their children? How do we help the parents to get all of the supports that they need, the services they need, in order to be able to be better parents? And how do we help caregivers who are helping children who may have high ACE scores, and those caregivers may have ACE scores of their own, you know, in a similar way. So really looking at constantly, you know, getting adequate supports for the whole family. And this also leads us to thinking about service coordination. increasingly integrated services within the community, and that can involve enhancing the social networks among providers, so strengthening those connections within and across service systems, and really considering the kind of culture or we space that we are creating in our programs and in our communities, and how we all contribute to that. Parenting skills and services, supports for caregiver ACE trauma background. So these are all pieces that we want to put together in the puzzle of offering comprehensive support for parents and caregivers. I want to mention some emerging practices. When we looked at the quadrants before and we mapped like the many opportunities for supporting parents and caregivers, I mentioned connecting people with professionals who might be trained in trauma-specific interventions, so that people are getting adequate services they need within their community. But I also want to mention to all of you that there are some emerging practices guided by theory, supported by basic science, that research is starting to be conducted on, which may be helpful to all of you in supporting parents and providers. And what I like about these emerging practices is that you need to learn them, we need to learn them ourselves before we can offer them to other people. And in practicing any of these ourselves, it could help to promote our own resilience, which supports our relationship building and role modeling, and our supportive alliance with the people that we work with, regardless of whether we teach these to the people that we're helping. So one is mindfulness meditation. If you Google University of Massachusetts and John Kabat-Zinn, you'll see that there's a whole CD set of mindfulness meditation that's been studied for helping people deal with anxiety and stress of medical problems. That one's probably the closest to being considered an evidence-supported intervention, but you don't have to have a particular professional background to learn to practice mindfulness meditation. Integrative restoration, or iRest, is based on Yoga Nidra. If you go to irest.us, you can, I think, download a little sample of it. It's a guided, bodily-oriented meditation. They also have a research tab. It's been found to be a promising adjunctive treatment to trauma. But again, whether or not you offer iRest for others, it may be helpful for you as somebody who supports parents and caregivers in promoting your own resilience. Somatic experiencing, if you Google Peter Levine and somatic experiencing, this is an approach to releasing trauma from the nervous system that does not involve having to talk about traumatic experiences. So that might be something that's of interest to people. And I know that you don't necessarily have to have a particular professional background to get trained in somatic experiencing, but again, it may be that just learning somatic experiencing could be helpful to the provider, to you as somebody who's supporting parents and caregivers in feeling more grounded and building your capacity for resilience as you help others. Also, the emotional freedom technique, which involves tapping on acupressure points. Many therapists are learning the emotional freedom technique for patients for whom other trauma-specific interventions are not necessarily working, but also people can use the emotional freedom technique as a self-care activity, and there's no requirement of having a particular professional background to learn the emotional freedom technique. You can go to emofree.com to learn more, and in the Capital Region, Mary Seiss does trainings on the emotional freedom technique, so you can also look her up as well. So key elements of restorative integral support to keep in mind when considering what does this mean for your work in supporting parents and caregivers. Well, one, there's raising community awareness of ACEs so that we all better understand ACEs and their consequences, that accumulated adversity and trauma can play out in people's lives in terms of health risk behaviors and health and social problems, and also that there's things we can do about it, that actually the support that you're providing may be really important in promoting people's resilience and recovery. So there's also integrating that resilience and recovery knowledge, engaging the staff and support persons in programs and community development, and looking at, what are the best practices, what are the values that we want to have pervade our support services, what kind of culture do we want to create together, how do we strengthen social networks across systems and help to coordinate systems more so that we're able to help families more holistically. Supporting staff self-care and caregiver self-care is key. Using this information for policy advocacy as well as raising community awareness of ACEs. I think policymakers can be really helpful in directing resources towards building programs that respond to adversity and trauma. And then next steps would be looking at the effectiveness of those programs and the impacts in our community. Leadership is key. It's important to note that leaders set the tone and the example, and that a culture builds around leaders. And we all have the potential to be leaders. So all of you can be leaders in self-care, I would say, is a first step in that, by promoting your own resilience so that that plays an important role in your relationship building and role modeling within your community. Down the road, there's a potential for team-based research partnerships as we consider these key elements of restorative integral support for parenting and caregiver support as we look at community impact and effectiveness. And I always like to end with this quote, thinking about recovery and transformation after we've done all this talk about adversity and trauma and consequences. This is from Joan Borisenko, Fire in the Soul. Some of the healthiest people I know are those who have had to heal from the most challenging situations, and in the process have gained insight and wisdom far beyond what a comfortable life would ordinarily provoke. So at this point, I'll stop, and you can, I think, type in questions in the chat function. Angelina can help with that.
Heather, thank you so much. At this time, I'd like to invite everybody that if you have any questions, and I know we have at least one question that just came in, but I want to send this link out to everybody that's on the screen, and I'm just typing and talking at the same time, www.posttraumawellness.net. I'm going to send that to everybody in your chat box. So this is a time that if you have specific questions about the content that was discussed today, or if you have any questions that you'd like Heather to answer, now is a great time to go ahead and type your question into the question box. I'll go ahead and read those out loud, and then Heather can respond to those. So again, this is giving everybody a few moments. We've got about 15 minutes or so left on the webinar, so there's time to ask questions. And Alice has asked, and this is just goes back to a couple slides ago, she wonders what is the reception, or what has the reception been by families for the emerging practices, and that includes the mindfulness meditation, EFT, and the other two, indicating that there's trouble getting staff to buy into those. So Heather, are you able to respond to that?
Well, that's a really good question. I honestly don't know what I could say about reception specifically of families to those practices. I would say that if staff aren't buying into them, then maybe it's just not, you introduce something, it could be a resource for promoting resilience and self-care, but different things are going to work for different people at different points in time. So my tendency wouldn't be to push it, but just to introduce it. And so then if staff aren't buying into it, then I think, as I said before, often, these could be important self-care activities for staff persons in terms of promoting their own resilience, whether or not they offer it to families. So if the staff people aren't buying into it, then I would say maybe that's not the particular thing to emphasize. The staff aren't likely to then offer it to the families, to give the families a chance to buy into it and for you to assess that. in your program. Certainly, if you look into any of the emerging practices, I think you can get a sense from the websites where they've been introduced to people and the kind of effectiveness they've had. I know, for example, irest.us, on their research tab, you can see that there's actually a whole range of research going on with integrative restoration offered to different populations in different settings. And you can look for similar things with the other emerging practices. But my approach, if staff were like saying, no, that's not really for us, that's not the direction we would go in, I would recognize that there's many ways people take care of themselves and many ways that we can promote our resilience, and different things might work for different people at different points in time for a whole variety of reasons. And what I've found in agencies that really take this on is helpful is to allow time, find time, set aside time for staff to be able to create their own peer support groups around self-care, to be able to discuss a range of self-care activities, and to assess how they're working for them over time. I'll acknowledge that for some people, smoking might be a self-care activity. The problem is it can have other later life consequences, just like we talked about with people sometimes with the higher ACE scores engaging in health risk behaviors as personal solutions to try to feel better. There's sometimes things that feel like self-care at one point, actually we've learned later are not the most effective ways for self-care. So if we can set up ways for people to be supported in self-care and assessing what's working in self-care and learn new skills and opportunities and be exposed to new ideas and offerings around self-care, I think that's probably the direction that I would go in, rather than pushing people beyond providing information about different specific self-care opportunities. I hope that's a helpful response.
Thank you so much for the question, Alice, and thank you, Heather, for your response. At this time, I just want to remind people we have time for questions. Go ahead and type those into the question box and we'll read those aloud. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Shoshana is asking to, if you might take a moment, Heather, to please expand on resilience, if you'd be willing to discuss specific ideas or tools that build upon resilience, and has also posed a second question that may be somewhat related. So in addition to expanding on resilience and what ideas or skills could build, or what ideas or tools could build the skill of resilience, Shoshana is also asking what are the most important parenting skills to perhaps promote in a class or a workshop to parents. So those may be related or they may be separate. So Heather, I'll let you answer that.
I'll do my best. You might need to remind me of parts of the question as I go along. First, I'll say that it may be helpful, too, to go back to the Restorative Integral Support webinar, where I went a little bit more in depth there in talking about resilience. I think, one of the reasons why I like that quadrant approach and have applied integral theory to Restorative Integral Support model for ACE trauma response is because it really helps us to see the complexity of people's capacity for resilience and how we can promote resilience. So, as I said, when you look at the ACE study conceptual framework of the pyramid, we really need to know more than that when we're thinking about how do we help somebody. We know that we can break the trajectory at any point during the way, and it's not the case that these high ACE scores have to lead to these negative life problems. So then we need a little bit more of a complex framework for thinking about, well, how do we promote resiliency and create protective factors for community resiliency and create resilient communities for individuals to hopefully thrive more in, et cetera. So really, I would say, thinking in terms of saying more about resilience, thinking about that from the quadrant perspectives that, for one thing, individual development, when people are growing up, we all are going through multiple lines of development. Historically, there's been a lot of focus on the cognitive line of development, Even the cognitive line of development, many people are familiar, for example, with the researcher Piaget. We know that people need to resolve one stage of development before they can get to the next stage of development. And so if something interferes with working through that stage of development, then it can derail development, right? And that's just one line. We know now that there are many lines of development, that there's emotional development, interpersonal development, psychological development, moral development, spiritual development. There's a whole host of researchers who have looked into these different kinds of developmental processes. And Howard Gardner is a researcher who looks at multiple intelligences. So when we realize that that young people are developing in so many different ways and have unique capacities and strengths in diverse areas, but also that when people don't have adequate support, particularly for accumulated and traumatic events in their lives, that it could interfere with those developmental processes, then that means that people at lower developmental stages just don't have as much of that developmental capacity for resilience. The more you're able to work through higher developmental stages, the more interior developmental capacity you have for resilience. But we also are learning more too about so many reasons why people might have more capacity for resilience than others. So it's really even just understanding the interior of people and their resilience capacities is getting more complex. Then combine that with, we also want to recognize that resilience, people's capacity for resilience, has not only to do with the supports within themselves, not only to do with their developmental capacity and capacity for resilience and unique strengths that contribute to their resilience, but also the extent to which people have supports, social networks that help them to be able to talk about things, share experiences, make meaning of things, move forward in life, make changes that help them to have a healthier life, to get out of bad situations, but also services and the extent to which services are accessible to people in different communities too. All of this plays a role in terms of people's resilience. The extent to which people have skills that are reflected in their behaviors for being able to deal with things in a healthier way, that's part of people's resilience. So that's the reason why I introduced those quadrants, really is getting at that there's so much to consider in terms of understanding resilience, but the good thing about that is that there's so many opportunities for enhancing people's resilience too then, by recognizing these different quadrant perspectives, and that an intervention that we might map to one quadrant, intervention or prevention activity or support activity that we might map to one quadrant, is going to act on all of the quadrants. And how you put those pieces together in terms of, what specific parenting training and skill supports you put together, combine using that perspective, is going to have a lot to do with your local resources, including the skills and capacities of the staff that you're working with who are providing the support services, and the training opportunities that you have. So, what I would suggest then doing is, if you're thinking about how do we put together different particular parenting training, start by looking at what's available in your community, what the staff know, and then get together and consider what next steps do we need to take and learn, and what other training opportunities are out there in terms of parenting skill development. And think about that within the context of the quadrants, and recognize that an important part of what I'm saying is that we need to include ourselves, our culture, our community within the context of our conceptual framework. So it's not just the parenting skill that you offer, but also a skill is taking care of ourselves and promoting our own resilience so that we're better able to offer whatever parenting skill it is that we're offering. And that we're in a better position to build relationships, role model, develop those alliances with parents and caregivers to support them in taking their own next steps, building on the current strengths and capacities that they have. I hope that's a helpful answer, but I think that just like when I go through a whole host of different, evidence-supported interventions for trauma-specific treatments, it may be that there's already skill development in one of those in a particular community, or more access to training in a particular community than another. And so which ones you choose have so much to do with your local resources. And what I'm offering is to look at this from a more holistic perspective, and put the pieces together, kind of using the quadrants as a way of identifying hotspots and where we might be strong in particular programs and where we might be able to pay more attention. And often there's a lot of attention paid to, what are the specific things I need to learn to do? And now we're having more attention start to be paid to the context or the climate within which those things are done, and how we can all contribute to a restorative context that might enhance whatever parenting skills and supports that it is that we're offering. I hope that that's a helpful response.
Heather, thank you so much. And Shoshana, I hope that's helpful for you. I know that's a lot of information, and I do want to say, Heather, thank you so much for that answer, because it also reminds me that I believe it's next week on Tuesday, we're going to have our next webinar in the series, which is on the ACE response, the risk model application for community capacity building. So that may be of interest to those of you that are on the line today. So if you haven't already registered, there's information at www.nicepep, that's NYSPEP.org. And after this webinar, I'll be posting the next webinar registration link. We've got about 4 minutes left, or 3 minutes, excuse me. And
I just want to mention, if I could, I had meant to put my email address on the last slide. It's hlarkin@albany.edu. That's Larkin, HLARKIN, hlarkin@albany.edu. If anybody wants the slides or background ACE articles.
Yes, thank you, Heather. And I've just sent that to everybody in the chat box right now. That's HLARKIN@albany.edu. You might want to jot that down or copy and paste that into like a Word document or a text file, so that you have that for future reference. This will be wrapping up here in about 2 minutes, and I want to make sure that everyone has the information to contact Heather. That email address will also appear in the thank you for attending automated email that will be sent out tomorrow afternoon. Again, please check your spam folder if you don't receive that by 2 p.m. But that will include some additional resources and information for you. So I just want to go back to the questions and make sure that we have responded to those that have come through. And it appears that we have. So we've got about a minute left. So Heather, are there any final words that you'd like to say before we close for the day?
Well, really just that I thank everybody for their interest in this topic and for their commitment to supporting parents and caregivers. And I know that everybody who's listening has their own unique skills and talents and reasons that they're able to do well at the job that they're doing. And I do encourage you to share this information in your own programs, to offer PowerPoint presentations or share the recordings of the webinars and other resources available on aceresponse.org or posttraumawellness.net as you move forward in your own work. And so I thank you for participating.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I want to thank everyone who attended today's webinar. Again, we will have the 4th webinar in the ACE series next week on Tuesday instead of Wednesday. So you can check the nicepep.org website in probably about 10 minutes or so, and you'll see the new registration link for that if you haven't already, and we hope you'll be joining us then. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.